Let's take a trip across the world, from Chernobyl to America, for a change, and another interesting and unique story taking place in Texas. The man at the centre of this story is one Kerry Andrus Crocker, born in 1931. Now, Crocker had what we will call a happy start to life. He got married in 1955, had two sons, and in May of 1970 he got divorced. Now, this divorce was not actually permanent, surprisingly. They actually remarried in July of that year, and divorced again in February of 1971. And this time there was no chance of them ever getting back together, as the mother of their two children married another man in December of that year, and they had parental custody. Crocker could only see his two children once every other weekend. Crocker did not take this well, of course, but what he did was by far the worst option for the matter. A month before his wife remarried, Crocker had applied for a license to possess a sealed capsule containing 1 curie of cesium-137, and it was approved. You might be wondering why, of course, but Crocker was a petroleum engineer, and he feigned legitimate reasons. Cesium-137 capsules were, and still are, frequently used for oil well logging. You drill the borehole with the cesium source attached, and the sides of the hole are blasted with high-intensity gamma rays, from which you can measure the density of oil in the site by seeing how much the radioactivity becomes attenuated, or reduced. Now, I said feigned, because Crocker's reasoning was not legitimate, and you can probably guess where this is going. And now he had one source, he was quickly able to obtain a second, and double the radioactivity in each capsule from 1 curie to 2. Flash forward to April of 1972. His eldest son, Michael Kirk Crocker, now 11, is visiting his father's apartment, and ends up watching TV. Crocker comes along and tells his son to wear headphones, as his neighbours have been complaining about the noise, and then leaves his son alone in the house with his mother. Much like anyone his age, he ended up playing with the headphones, and what does he find? A metal capsule inside each of the ear cushions, concealed under some cotton. He removes the headphones and continues about his day, with his father suddenly very upset he wasn't wearing the headphones. In July of 1972, Crocker struck again, and this time he was far more nefarious. He gave Michael a glass of orange juice, after which he began to feel sleepy and quickly fell asleep on a couch in his den. As it turns out, Crocker had laced it with a sleeping pill. When he woke up, Michael found the same 2 cylinders stuffed in a sock underneath his bed. On a nearby table was some equipment he didn't recognise that was in fact source handling equipment Crocker used to transfer the capsules. The following morning, he began to feel nauseous and threw up. At the next visit that month, Crocker did a similar thing, giving him orange juice and wait for him to get tired. As a party was taking place at the apartment, he ended up sleeping in the main bed, and when they woke up, Crocker and his brother were sleeping in a completely different apartment, and again, there were now 3 capsules in a sock under his pillow, and he began vomiting more. At the same time, he also found rashes beginning to form on his thighs. Michael was quick to point out these rashes, and by August he was in and out of hospital as doctors were perplexed by these unusual rashes. But nobody had put 2 and 2 together, and visitation continued. That month, Crocker went out with his younger son, while Michael was specifically instructed to lie on a couch while they were out. Now getting very suspicious, Michael had a look under the couch to find the same sock with the same cylinders, and when Crocker returned, he was seen leaving the house with the sock held at arm's length, which he put in the car. 2 months later, Crocker had reverted to his old technique, a glass of orange juice and waiting for his son to fall asleep. But he had given up his already poor attempts at hiding the socks, laying out the sock directly on his thighs. At this point, to avoid his own exposure, Crocker would sleep in a car outside while the source was in his apartment. For the next 2 months, Michael's legs continued to deteriorate as treatments failed and no cause could ever be determined. And he was under almost constant medical supervision, incidentally saving him from any more exposure to the cesium. In December, a plastic surgeon was eventually called in to perform some skin grafts in an attempt to save his legs. And, by luck, this surgeon had experience in performing skin grafts on patients who had been exposed to radiation while treating their cancer. That's radiation necrosis. Necrosis ulceration due to radiation, he said. By January of 1974, almost 2 years after the first incident, the pieces of the puzzle were finally put together, and the stepfather realised that these unusual cylinders Michael had found were radioactive sources. He called the Radiation Control Branch of the Texas Department of Health Resources, and then sent a letter as well, detailing the allegations, mentioning Kerry Crocker by name, and all the medical information. The police did some investigation, but Crocker had covered up his deeds well. When they investigated his business, the records showed that his business was not licensed to handle these sources. How did he manage to do this? Well, unfortunately for Crocker, the inspector remembered his name, and the company he worked at 3 years ago. He'd simply changed jobs. The license was still there, and he was the only one on the license with permission to handle the cesium. And yet, despite this major investigation, where they quickly had him effectively dead to rights, there was no actual change in the relationship between Crocker and the Radiation Control Branch that held his license, going so far as performing a completely normal inspection with him. A smart move, and keeping Michael out of danger by ensuring that his father kept the radioactive source at another facility, and they were instructed to report if Crocker ever went to collect the radioactive sources. They even allowed him to transfer them to another facility and then terminate the license, when it became apparent that he would not get the chance to attack Michael again. On May 2nd, Crocker was indicted on 5 felonies and arrested the same day. Bond was initially set at $50,000, but reduced to $10,000, and he was back out again. The trial would begin in March of 1975, and after just 10 hours of deliberation, the 12-person jury came back with a guilty verdict, and he was sentenced to a $5,000 fine and 10 years imprisonment. Crocker appealed his sentence, and was still free for the time being, and actually kept visitation rights with his younger son, with restrictions of course. 3 years later, now 1978, Crocker's appeal was heard, and almost immediately struck down. But Crocker decided instead to skip town, thus starting an FBI manhunt to find him. He was eventually tracked down to Wyoming, more than 6 years after he was found guilty in the first place. And so Crocker went to serve a now 15-year sentence, only to be released after 5 years. He'd actually been well behaved in prison, and earned enough good behaviour credits to become eligible. Michael, 25 at this point, of course tried to get the courts to throw out his parole. But this was refused, and Crocker moved to a halfway house in Texas, and disappeared from the limelight. As for Michael, his previously promising athletic capability was lost with his skin grafts and other injuries, and he instead began researching the laws surrounding the licenses that allowed his father to harm him, leaving him permanently requiring testosterone shots for the rest of his life. And this actually resulted in a change in the laws in Texas, and eventually became a successful real estate agent.